Great. Hello, my name is Robert Doherty, and my persuasion speech is on whether the Beatles are the greatest band of all time instead of the Rolling Stones. So, people often ask the question, who is the greatest band of all time? Of course, people's musical taste is their own prerogative, and everybody's is going to differ slightly, but more often than not, this question comes down to two answers: the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Today I'm going to tell you why the Beatles are the greatest band of all time and not the Rolling Stones, because of the influence the Beatles had over the Rolling Stones. They had a more significant output in a shorter amount of time. They explored more musical genres, were bigger pop culture icons, and because the members of the Beatles had more successful solo careers. So first off, the Beatles had a huge influence on the Rolling Stones. In fact, in an interview that John Lennon had with Rolling Stone magazine, he said that if you compare the two bands' outputs, the Rolling Stones were always copying what the Beatles did 6 months later. This can especially be seen in the Rolling Stones' 1967 album, Her Satanic Majesties, which many view as just their version of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album. It's also interesting to note that the Rolling Stones' first top 20 hit, the single, I Want to Be Your Man, was actually written by the Beatles' two main songwriters, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. As well as an influence the Beatles had on the Rolling Stones, they also had a greater amount of music they put out. So second, the Beatles had a greater output in a shorter amount of time. For the 6 years that the Beatles were a recording band, they put out 12 full-length albums, as well as 24 singles. Compared to the Rolling Stones, who during that time were almost as productive as the Beatles, but since around 1975 have been very less consistent. So the Rolling Stones have been touring for decades on material that they've only released in the 60s and 70s, which didn't even add up to the amount of the material the Beatles put out. Also, according to the Billboard Book of Singles, the Beatles have had more number one hits and more gold singles. As well as having a greater output, the Beatles also had a more diverse output as the Rolling Stones. In the short time that the Beatles were a recording band, they explored almost every musical genre, including pop, doo-wop, blues, psychedelic music, and even Indian music. Where the Rolling Stones, the majority of their output is only blues rock or country rock. As well as exploring more genres, the Beatles also were bigger pop culture icons. This is especially evident when the Beatles came to America first and were on the Ed Sullivan Show. They were an international sensation, changing things people did, including their haircuts. The Beatles also starred in two movies where the four Beatles were the stars: A Hard Day's Night and Help. A Hard Day's Night is critically acclaimed as being a very funny movie and almost setting the precedent for what a boy band is expected to do. If the Beatles as a band are a huge pop culture sensation, but also their individual members have done more than the members of the Rolling Stones individually. The solo career, so fifth, I'll be talking about the solo careers of some of the members of both bands. All four Beatles members in their solo career had a number one hit. And Paul McCartney was one of the top 3 best-selling acts of the 70s. John Lennon also wrote the song Imagine, which is often cited as one of the best songs of all time. And when it comes to the members of the Rolling Stones, although Mick Jagger and Keith Richards have both put out a few albums that are critically accepted, their overall output doesn't compare to the solo members of the Beatles. So, in conclusion, if anybody ever asks you what the greatest band of all time is, Of course, you're going to have your own opinions and the type of music you like, but at least you should be able to see that it should be the Beatles instead of the Rolling Stones because of the influence they had over the Rolling Stones, the greater amount of output in a shorter amount of time, the amount of genres they explored, the pop culture sensation they were, and the solo careers the Beatles had. Thank you.